Joshua 2 opens with Israel standing on the edge of transition. The wilderness generation had passed away, and the people were preparing to enter the land promised long before to Abraham. Yet the focus of the chapter is not on armies or military strategy, but on a woman named Rahab. Her story becomes a picture of mercy, triumphing over judgment, faith overcoming fear, and outsiders being brought near through trust in God. Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho secretly, and they entered the house of Rahab. This immediately reveals something important about the nature of God's work. Rahab was not someone Israel would have considered worthy or qualified. She was a Gentile living in a condemned city, yet she became the very person through whom God preserved the spies and demonstrated his saving purpose. The chapter emphasizes that God's covenant blessings were never about ethnic superiority or human merit. God responds to faith. Rahab had heard about what God had done for Israel, the crossing of the Red Sea and the defeat of powerful kings east of the Jordan. The fear of the Lord had spread throughout the land. Jericho represents humanity confronted with the reality of God's kingdom. Some hardened themselves in fear and resistance, but Rahab responded differently. She believed. Her confession in Joshua 2:11 is central to the chapter. The Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Rahab recognized the sovereignty of God before Israel ever entered the city. She saw that the old order around her was doomed and that God was establishing something new. Faith allowed her to separate herself from the judgment coming upon Jericho. The scarlet cord becomes one of the most powerful symbols in the chapter. Rahab was instructed to place it in her window so that when judgment came, her household would be spared. The imagery echoes the Passover in Egypt, where blood marked the homes of those protected from destruction. Salvation was not based on Rahab's performance, but on trusting the promise given to her. The cord represented identification with the covenant people and confidence in God's mercy. This chapter also anticipates the inclusion of the nations into God's family. Rahab, though formerly outside the covenant, would later become part of Israel and appear in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. God's plan was always larger than one nation. The salvation extended to Rahab foreshadowed the gathering together of people from every background into one redeemed family through faith. From a covenantal perspective, Jericho represents the fading world of the old age that stood under judgment, while Rahab represents those who escaped destruction by trusting in God's deliverance. The destruction of Jericho later in Joshua is not merely about military conquest. It reflects the removal of an old order standing against God's kingdom purposes. Rahab's rescue in the midst of that judgment illustrates how God preserves those who trust him while bringing an end to what opposes his covenant reign. The spies themselves are also important symbols in the narrative. Though Israel was preparing for battle, victory ultimately did not depend upon human strength or military intelligence. The chapter repeatedly highlights that the land had already been given by God. Rahab herself testified that the hearts of the inhabitants had melted in fear. The outcome was already determined before the battle began. Joshua 2 therefore teaches reliance upon God's finished promise rather than confidence in human effort. Another major theme is rest. Israel was nearing the end of its wilderness wandering and approaching inheritance. Rahab entered into that inheritance through faith before many in Israel fully experienced it. In this sense, she becomes an example of entering God's promise not by law, lineage, or striving, but by believing what God has spoken. The chapter closes with the spies returning to Joshua and declaring that the Lord had delivered the land into their hands. Their confidence rested entirely on what God had already accomplished. Rahab's faith became evidence that God was going before his people and preparing salvation even in unexpected places. Joshua 2 ultimately reveals a God who rescues outsiders, honors faith, and brings people safely through judgment into covenant blessing. Rahab stands as a testimony that no past, nationality, or condition can prevent someone from entering God's grace when they trust in him.